Hi, you're listening to She Shield, your one-stop pod for all topics personal safety. I'm your host, Sofia, and my goal is to help educate women and men on concealed carry, martial arts, and all topics self-defense. This episode is brought to you by Big Tech's Ordnance, your soon-to-be favorite retailer for all of your firearms needs. BTO believes in only selling high-quality gear for responsibly armed citizens, as well as providing pre- and post-sale support. BTO values firearms training and supports firearms instructors nationwide. They even pay for their own staff to train with high-level instructors to ensure that when you as the consumer reach out, you are taken care of. Today we have Christopher Cook back on the show. This is the third episode with Chris because he's just got so much knowledge for you guys that we thought it would be best to split this all up. So I'm really excited for this episode. It's going to be a little bit more specialized in a few regions. But to start out, Chris, I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it. For those of you guys who don't know me, my name is Chris Cook. I run a shooting performance and self-defense training company based out of Salt Lake City, Utah called Odyssey Training and Consulting. I have been an instructor for about just over 4 years now. I've been a serious student of self-defense and shooting performance for about 12 years now. Kind of been a training nerd throughout our industry. Out of all of the classes I teach, my experience, classes I've taken, the kind of thing I focus the most on is that civilian self-defense problem, and typically the use of handguns in some type of self-defense role, either home defense or concealed carry. So that's me.
Wonderful. Yes. And I would love for you to just go ahead and list the classes you currently offer. I feel like that's so important for the listeners to know.
Sure. Yeah. My kind of training progression is set up again for your everyday person, Joe or Jane Schmo, not looking for trouble and the problems that they're likely to face in their concealed carry lifestyle or for home defense. So pistol foundations and pistol for performance are 4 and 8 hour classes, specifically, again, focusing on that use of a pistol in self-defense. If you've really never shot a handgun before, or you're brand new to concealed carry or something like that, pistol foundations is for you. And that's simply, getting a good draw stroke in, good shooting control, multiple targets, and starting to get some decision making going on, which is really important, again, for the problem we're trying to face. Pistol performance is an 8 hour class that kind of splits up. Half of the day is some performance shooting stuff that we get from a lot of the competition world about how to just shoot better and how can you really start to get your performance to the next level. And then we take all of that good human performance aspect in the afternoon and we apply it around things like cover and concealment, movement, things of that nature. So that's pistol performance. I also teach a low light pistol class that is, again, specific to how people like us have to fight in low light, which sometimes requires handheld and whip mounted flashlights, sometimes doesn't. And then also how we use white light as a deterrent, which is kind of unique. A lot of times, most low light pistol classes are kind of turn the light on, shoot the target, turn the light off kind of classes. But we get to expand a little bit more into if you're carrying a flashlight every day, that's not necessarily only for a lethal force encounter. There's a lot of really versatile options that you can use your everyday carry flashlight for. So that's a fun class. I teach situational awareness concepts. That one's not gun related at all. It's all about how we notice danger, talking our way out of stuff. You've taken Craig Douglas's ECQC before, as have I, and the Managing Unknown Contacts curriculum is a very, very good baseline for how to learn how to be decisive when you're being interacted with by a stranger in public without simply kind of waiting around to see what happens next. How do you talk your way out without creating a problem and being antagonistic, right? So we get to go through all of that. We do things like pepper spray deployment. We get to practice with, water spray trainers and stuff like that for a lot of people who carry pepper spray but have never gotten to actually practice with it. So that's a fun class. And then actually at the end of this month, we're coming out with a rifle class, civilian rifle skills. That one's going to be pretty unique as well. There's a ton of good rifle training out there. You can find a ton of people with a ton of experience in that, typically in the military role with ARs. But looking again at how civilian ownership of ARs is really, really prevalent. And people often use them for home defense, or as we saw through the kind of 2020 era with rioting and things like that, how do people use those tools for community defense? And there's some specialized problems that come along with that. So that class is a deep dive into, again, how a civilian is using a rifle. It's really not like any other rifle class you've probably seen before. And that's our training gamut right now. We got some other classes in the works for next year, but that's what I teach.
Wonderful. And yes, I wish I was closer to you. You're definitely on my short list to travel to because all of those classes sound amazing. As someone who just moved from an apartment to a house, I've definitely been thinking about rifle training
Mhm.
for home defense. But to be completely honest with you, the most I've done is just, target to target transition
Target
training,
on the
a little bit of
range. Yep.
accuracy, just the most basic training. Luckily, I had a really great instructor with me, but we only had so much time for that. So I
Totally.
love that you're bringing that into your curriculum. Because we're already on the topic, I'd love to talk about that a little bit. I know today one of our big topics is going to be vehicle tactics. So if that's interesting to you, definitely stick around. Otherwise, for those interested in setting up kind of a home defense system, what would you say for someone who's maybe trying to choose between a pistol and a rifle? Like, what should they consider?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. In general, if we know we have to go to a lethal force encounter, our option is going to be a long gun. That's a very general answer, but if we knew we had to go to a fight for our life, we wouldn't choose a handgun. They're not very powerful. They're hard to hit things with, hard to hit things far away. They just have certain disadvantages. No military unit arms everyone with pistols. They choose rifles that they can possibly choose to. So my plan A home defense option is an AR, and mine is set up again for home defense. It's not super specialized. A normal kind of run of the mill AR-15 with a couple of accessories is a very, very effective tool. But that's my option. Shotguns are also available. They've been around quite a long time. But I typically consider a shotgun kind of a master's weapon. They typically take more training to run as effectively as you can run a rifle, like an AR. So they certainly have done well for a long time, but shotguns, need some specialized training in there. But in general, AR, if you're going to have to be pretty mobile for some reason, and there are reasons to do that, a pistol does have a lot of advantages where it's a lot handier, right? If for example, I have a 9-month-old that is across the hall from me. If I knew I needed to carry her from A to B or something like that, that may be an option where Plan A is a handgun. Just the way the geometry of my house works out, my wife and I's plan, I don't really have to carry her. I can focus with the big gun on taking care of whatever's going on, and she can focus on the child. But if I was a single parent or something like that, that's where, again, a pistol may be more versatile, I guess. But regardless of whether we pick a rifle or a handgun, most of the people already have or should have an everyday carry handgun that they're keeping nearby, either in a fingerprint safe or something like that, that can also be pressed into service as a home defense tool. So if you're only going to have one gun, a good handgun can serve both purposes pretty well. But if you want to specialize, a rifle is a good option too. So that's kind of my thought on rifle versus handgun. If you know you have to carry stuff, handgun maybe, but in general, rifles are very, very effective. They work really well.
Wonderful. Yes, the most I've thought about when it comes to choosing between the two is kind of whether or not I'm in a big enough kind of house for that. So before I lived in a
Mhm.
450 bougie closet, is what we called it. But so for that apartment, I always felt like my pistol was the best option. My rifle was always kind of just put away in my closet. It was ready
Mhm.
to go if there was like an end of world situation, but as far as home defense, I didn't grab for it. Do you think that that's the case where you really should only use a rifle if you're in a home large enough and separated from your neighbors?
Yeah, that's not necessarily. I don't typically think about it in terms of like engagement distances, right? If I knew I needed to make a far shot, obviously the rifle is going to be that good choice. But when we look at stuff in like an urban area and we look at kind of that rule 4 being certain of our target and aware of our target's environment, again, this is a generality, but AR rounds typically will go through less material than a pistol round. So, having, 5.56 is relatively small, but going really, really fast. And it breaks up into sheetrock and studs and furniture and things like that quicker than a 9 mil hollow point or anything like that. So to look at the safety of the public, in an urban area, an AR is actually a safer tool to use. Now, this is the kind of dichotomy that we get into between using, gear isn't as important as good tactics, right? Good gear never makes up for bad tactics. So I wouldn't make a shooting solution and say, yep, I know for a fact that there's someone behind this wall. Good thing I picked, insert your gear choice, shotgun bird shot or a light and fast 5.56 round or something like that. I wouldn't say, yep, I know this is a Rule 4 issue, but I picked a good piece of equipment for it and make that shot. I would still work to change the geometry of the problem and, get to a different angle or something like that. But it just gives you a little bit more insurance than something like, shotgun slugs or something like that that are going to penetrate quite a bit of stuff.
That is so good to know. I honestly did not know that. That's something I need to probably do a little bit more research on before I teach even an intro to handgun class. I feel like that could very easily.
Well, most of what we're talking about when we talk about basic things, right? Those things are a foundation for something greater, right? I teach a pistol basics class that I didn't even mention. It's a 2-hour intro to handgun class. And I've taught that, well over 250 times, in the last 4 years. I teach that class a lot to new shooters. And very recently, we've got a kind of cadre of staff instructors that are teaching some of those more basic courses under, the Odyssey brand and things like that. But whether or not, even if this person's, never shot a gun before, they're just looking for a good time on the range, we still want to teach them in a way that it would be progressive, that they could then, learn stuff later on. And I've gotten, even in the basic class, I've gotten the most off the wall questions you can imagine from students where they're like, hey, well, what about this thing over here? And it's like, okay, well, that's not in the curriculum, but I need an answer for that. I can't just say, that's a good question. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, that's, there's some really good research from Dr. Gary Roberts. He was a ballistician for many, many, many years. I think he's still around. I haven't seen any of his stuff recently, but early 2000s, mid 2000s, all that kind of stuff. He did a ton of good work with the FBI and other people on wound ballistics and penetration and things like that. And he's got a lot of good data on the internet that you could look up. Brand by brand, caliber by caliber, grain by grain, what type of bullet works well, what type of bullet, does well at this test, but not that test, all those kinds of things. There's awesome data from him, and he's got really, really good information on 5.56 specifically with normal ball ammo and then with specialty loads too. So definitely, if you're a nerd about ballistics, you can read about that.
Absolutely. I will link his studies in the show notes of this episode. So if you want to scroll down and kind of look through that as we are chatting today, you can absolutely do that. So Dr. Gary Roberts, very cool. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That's the kind of information I feel like needs more attention. And of course, that's why She Shield was created. So we can talk about, more niche topics on here, ones that of course deserve attention and need to be shared. So thank you for bringing our attention to that. That's awesome.
You can open up any can of worms about all of my gun nerdery, and it'll all pour out. So,
Perfect.
I'm always happy to chat about stuff.
Wonderful. And I might even shoot you a text if I get crazy questions in my classes. I'm starting to teach on, I believe, August 9th is my first class. So super soon.
Coming up quick.
And yes, my goal, if I'm asked a question I don't know the answer to, is just to take down their information, get the answer, and then write them, or maybe even write the class. I've thought about creating like a Discord of like previous students so that if they wanted to ask questions afterwards, they can just write in, but also like keep it respectful, which I feel like Discord has a lot of places for that. So I might be doing something like that, and I can cite you in there and give your information out as well. Okay, so besides your new rifle class, do you have any new Odyssey developments you'd like to share with anyone from the first few episodes?
It has been, it's been a wonderful 2023 training season. Out here in Utah, the summertime is where we've got to pack all the outdoor training in. We did the Utah Performance Expo back in March, which was a collaborative class between me and two other instructors, Scott Garcia of Advent Training and Devin Soto of Tactical Cowboy Training Solutions. And that was a really interesting class. There's more of these types of classes popping up, but all the students got to train with each of us individually and see some of the specialties that we focus on, our teaching style, things like that. They got a little bit of exposure to multiple instructors. And then from there, they can make a choice about investing in a specific instructor that they either like their teaching style more or like their specialty more. And that was a super fun time back in March. We've got another one coming up at the end of September. So that one's going to be fun. Again, the three of us, we're each teaching a specialty of ours. I'll be teaching high stakes marksmanship, which is going to be pretty fun. And that's a 4-hour block on when everything rides on a single trigger press. Not only the mechanical aspects of shooting the gun and making a hit, but then also the emotional aspects of what's it going to be like basically in those really, really high consequence things like hostage rescue shots, all of that. It's not really a topic that's touched on a lot in the civilian world. It's touched on a lot in the military world, sometimes special operations and SWAT teams and things like that. But we do see times where people with a firearm try to do a good thing. They try to keep somebody else safe. They try to protect themselves. They try to protect somebody else, but they don't have the skills to back up the attempt, right? So getting people to understand not just necessarily how to be a good shooter, right? We can always make people better shooters, but how do you sometimes know your own limitations and know, looking at my sights or my dot right now, I cannot guarantee success. And rather than hoping for the best and pressing the trigger, how do you maneuver closer? How do you, do something else? So that's going to be a fun class. I'm really looking forward to it. And we've had an awesome time. We're continuing to expand out here in Utah. I got to take a pretty fun instructor development class last month on some vehicle tactics. So that was a good time, and trying to, again, kind of expand the repertoire a little bit.
Wonderful. And would you go over what vehicle tactics is? I feel like that phrase alone can be a little confusing.
Yeah, not a problem. And that is a very wide field in our world, where you could think of something like Secret Service motorcade tactics and combatives in jiu-jitsu in an in-vehicle carjacking or robbery. Those two things both involve vehicles, but they are not even not close to the same, right? Right. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes into, working vehicles. And what I'm specifically trying to focus on, again, for the Odyssey mission, is civilian self-defense, right? And how do people get attacked around their vehicle? What's kind of a recipe for success, both in the situational awareness aspect, when we're doing things like in parking lots and stuff, and then how do we use a vehicle successfully for cover? How do we maneuver around vehicles successfully? All that kind of stuff. So what I'm more focusing on is that gunfight in and around a car, which is extremely common for civilians, just in the nature of urban areas and all that kind of stuff. And that's similar to the class that I took recently.
Wonderful. Yes. So I think the first time I've ever been introduced to vehicle tactics is when you came on the podcast, to be honest with you. I've seen, police body cam footage or just, CCTV footage of struggles happening in and around a car. But until you and I talked about how that is a transitional space and how the majority of attacks happen in transitional spaces, it didn't occur to me that I, as a civilian, need that. So for those that are maybe kind of trying to decide if they should get into this part of their training, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. It's as important as understanding things like home defense tactics and interior geometry of your house. What's a good place to be? What's not a good place to be? But vehicles are they're a part of our world that's very underserved. And there's a lot of really old legacy training that's still floating around that has like very little basis in reality or success, but there's still very big, very popular classes that people take. And there's an attempt right in our world to try and change that. And we're trying to modernize a lot of how we work around cars, but there is quite a bit of this was how it was taught in 1998, and we're just going to keep teaching it that way, right? And that's not what we want to do. We haven't done that with the competition world. We haven't done that with the low light world. We haven't done that with the combatives and jiu-jitsu world. Everything else seems to advance, but fighting around cars. So, for me, I've taken different vehicle classes throughout the years. I took a couple of them a long time ago, and then more recently took Craig Douglas's not his ECQC class, VCAST, VCAST, Vehicle Combatives and Shooting Tactics. That was his 2.5 day class on vehicle work. He has some really interesting experience as an undercover narcotics officer, right? Of actually having to fight over guns and knives inside the passenger compartment of a vehicle. And that's a very unique problem. It does happen in the civilian world. Not a lot, right? It's not happening all the time, but it's more than we care to admit. And there's very, very little training out there for it. So that class was really, really interesting, both shooting around cars and in cars, having to deal with things like third-party issues, right? A lot of people, will look at it and say, well, I've got a kid that sits in the back seat, or I've got my wife next to me in the passenger seat, or maybe my wife is driving and I'm in the passenger seat. How do you manage a gun in the passenger compartment? How do you get out well? All of that. So that was a really, really fun class. And then more recently, last month, I took Centrifuge Training's Vehicle CQB instructor class. That's a 5-day instructor development class for their program around vehicles, which is doesn't really have much to do with fighting in the car, right? With combatives and stuff, but that one focuses on gunfights in the vehicle, out, and then also around cars in different circumstances and configurations. Their program is a very specific program for law enforcement, and they use a lot of evidence and data on how law enforcement gunfights happen around vehicles to support some of their methodologies. Their methodologies are a little controversial sometimes. There's a lot of people that maybe, they'll see a drill on Instagram, or they'll hear something from a buddy about, hey, this company is teaching people to do X or something like that. And they get a lot of flack for some of the stuff they do. But I took it as as a professional instructor, and I am also I've been in this world a long time, so I was given the opportunity to take that class. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of, not necessarily, certainly some ways to fight around cars, but more about some instructorship and instructor methodology, how we build programs, how we build curriculum, and what we really should be basing our teaching off of, which really shouldn't be, I think this is a good idea, right? And there are people building programs off of, well, there was a guy in my department back in 2004 that got in a gunfight like this, so this is how I teach my vehicle class. And it's like, bro, that is like 6 steps removed from a good idea to teach that way, right? So that was a really fun class. I really enjoyed it. We got to do a lot of really fun drills, and I was able to take quite a bit away from it.
I love that you brought that up. As someone who's, first of all, starting to get into instruction, it is an art. And luckily, I have a book by Mike Sieglander. It's his instruction kind of manual. It's called The Art of Instruction. I thought that's what it was, but I kind of doubted myself, so I just looked over at it.
You went over to saw you yes. Cite your source. This is an open book test.
Exactly.
Sophie. Yeah.
Exactly. So test anxiety. So yes, I'm excited to have his book, and also I'm so thankful I have all these connections in the industry to help me do what I'm doing correctly. And I've shadowed quite a few classes leading up to this. I'm going to go shadow a few more, even just to make sure I'm not missing anything in my curriculum. But
totally,
I am glad you brought that up, especially because I had someone from a previous class write me, and I've brought this up on the podcast before, and because of a different situation, but he wrote me and said that I was looking down at my gun too much during my Get Ready With Me videos, which I try to be as clear as possible that most likely you will not have to pull your gun in a situation where someone's running at you from 50 feet away and you have time to amen and everything. So that's just me showing the mechanics of the draw from the particular outfit I'm wearing. But people always, people be people. So
people nitpick.
he wrote me, you really, Yes, nitpick. He wrote me and he was like, you need to stop looking down. And I was like, man, where am I looking down? He was like, when you're reholstering. And I was like, okay, why do you say that? Like, tell me, what your reasoning is. And he
Yeah.
basically said he had a law enforcement buddy who got attacked while reholstering. And if he would have been looking up, he wouldn't have got attacked. And he probably about 2 years ago, I would have read that and been like, oh, he has a good point. I'm going to stop looking down, and like probably would have just taken it without really
Taking
thinking
it at
into
face
it.
value. Yep.
Exactly. And I'm not saying I'm an expert at, really anything with guns. That's at least how I see myself and what I try to tell people. But I've gotten to a place where I can filter information a little bit more. So I really like that they're teaching not only the tactics itself, but why the tactics have, come to be and
Totally.
how to put them correctly into a curriculum. So I absolutely love that.
Yeah, no, and that's the looking down when you reholster is a fantastic point. Exactly spot on, right? Where that was taught for decades. Don't look at your holster. Don't look at your holster. Keep your head up when you're reholstering. Like you got to watch, and especially in the law enforcement world where if they have their gun out, balance of probability in general, they have not shot anybody. They've gotten someone at gunpoint and they have gotten compliance. And now they're going to put their gun away and arrest that person. Neither one of those things are in my job description, right? Of 2 a.m. with a dude in my living room that I'm yelling at, right? I don't need to put my gun away and go tackle him or something weird. So
right.
that idea of, well, this one time, this one guy looked at his holster. Now, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Keeping his head up would not have prevented him from being attacked. He still would have gotten attacked. He just would have seen it coming and would have had the opportunity to move or something like that, right? It doesn't solve the problem, keeping your head up. It just makes you more aware slightly, right? But we can counterbalance, hey, this guy's going to, jump up and, tackle you or whatever, versus the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who shoot themselves while reholstering because they have their shirt caught in their trigger guard. They have a piece of brass in their holster, piece of gravel, the jacket pull tabs on raincoats, little things on the bottoms that you pull. All of those get caught in holsters and fire guns. I mean, a lot. So if we had to balance the risk, I'd rather not shoot myself on the, 15,000 times this year I'm going to reholster a gun and, maybe take that risk when I'm doing something weird at gunpoint with a guy. So yeah, that's a myth that's got to die in my opinion.
Yes, it must die. That was probably the first tip Tessa of Armed and Styled graciously wrote me and was like, hey, I saw your video where you were reholstering, excuse me. And I think you could slow down a little bit. Like, think about it, right? Like there's no reason you should be quickly reholstering. And I was like, oh my God, like mind blown. Ever since then, she's been a really big guide for me, but moving on from that, it's just so important to question like every little thing you do. I still do it. I learn pretty much every time I train how little I know. And you can look at that a few ways, right? You can look at it and be like, wow, I have so much to learn. This is really daunting. Or you can get excited. So try to stay on the other side. And I do want to tell you the last thing he said to me, because I wrote back essentially what you said, just not as eloquently, professionally, because people screenshot. And I don't know, I didn't want to give him that.
Yeah.
And he said,
I should probably work on that. There's people who have DMs for me that probably shouldn't end up in the public domain.
I'm sure it's fine. That like part of me that needs to sleep at night,
Yeah.
And I don't want him to have like anything on me because anyway, but I understand. I've done that before as well. Don't get me wrong. His last response was, well, it's your gunfight, so do whatever you want.
Yep.
Yes.
It's the wonderful part of Instagram, right? I actually,
Yes,
speaking of that, so
is.
I listened to your episode about comments that you and Lisa have gotten.
Yes.
Dang. The internet sucks. I'll say that. The internet.
It absolutely
stinks.
does. I'm laughing, but it's bad.
Yeah, no, it's bad out there. No, I was laughing, like listening. I was just like, I've gotten, people argue with me in the DMs and all that kind of stuff, and that's totally fine. It's part of public discourse, right? But, every once in a while you run up against a weirdo and it's no fun.
Yes.
So, yeah. The wonderful world of the internet that we get to work in. It's just fantastic.
Yes. And sometimes it's easy to feel alone because that side isn't talked about a lot. And sometimes people will post to their stories like a crazy DM they get, but really going into detail about, we really tried to talk about how we cope with that and where we've come, from when we first got our first crazy comment to now. But yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed that. Hey, and if you ever get to a point where you have a list or maybe an album in your phone of screenshots, I'd love for you to come on.
I've got a ton. They're called gun dummies and they happen once a week.
Yes.
So Odyssey_TC on Instagram.
Yeah, that could be a whole episode of me just reading those off. So
gun dummies is awesome. That's my outlet for the terrible things of people's ignorance and all that kind of stuff. Like there's stuff I hear in the gun store. There's stuff I'm just like, oh my gosh. So then, if you guys don't know and you're listening, I have a meme on my Instagram that I'll put out weekly called Gun Dummies. And it's the wonderful things that I see people either misprioritizing their training or, holding on to old myths or, today I had a pistol basics class on Saturday that, a woman showed up. Well, actually, I had 3 ladies show up. One of them, she was like, I've shot my gun once and it was 30 years ago. And I was like, okay. The other 2 were like friends. They signed up together and they said, our husbands bought us these guns. They're matching and we haven't shot them yet. The first woman had a detective special. Yeah. She had an old 38 special revolver, which are actually like really nice, but not an easy gun to shoot by any means, right? She had kind of moderate arthritis, and she was like, I can't pull the trigger back all the way. Like my grip, I'm pretty frail, and it's a 12-pound trigger, and it's just not happening. So I was like, okay, well, guess what? I'm lovingly. Don't put, that's not the gun for you. Go buy a whatever. And then the other 2 had like a Beretta PX4 Storm, which is a double action, single action, hammer fired gun. And it's got a slide mounted safety and decocker. And there's all these buttons on it. And they're like, wait, I got to do it this way. And I'm like, yep. And they're like, this is now my husband's gun. Which gun should I buy? I'm like, all right, striker fired, So those ended up on Gun Dummies of like, if you send your wife to class with like the most complicated gun in the world and she hasn't shot it before, like, come on.
Right.
So yeah, it's we're making the culture better 1 week at a time.
Absolutely.
We'll get there.
Absolutely. Something actually, I just remembered this. Tessa said, she brought up a really good point. We just had an episode, so I know I'm bringing her up a lot because we just talked about all this.
No, you're good. She's fantastic. Tessa's, I've watched her content for a long time. She's got great information. I use the Filster, all of her guides in my concealed carry classes. Like, she's awesome.
Amazing. Yes, absolutely, man. So she mentioned that she thought the episode with Lisa and I was going to be like busting myths of the gun industry, like common myths. And I was like, dude, you just gave me the best idea ever. So definitely credit her with that. If you ever want to compile a list of common myths, I think that would be a really fun episode. Even if you have some today that are just on the top of your head, I would love that with you. I don't get a lot of that. I think a good example is looking when you reholster, speed of reholstering.
Yep.
But
there are circumstances where we might need to put the gun away quickly. Like they're rare, but again, I only speak from the civilian self-defense concealed carry world, right? I'm not talking about military or anything like that. But there are times where we got to put the gun away with expediency, right? You could think of a larger, dangerous situation that you need use of both of your hands, right? When we look at the medical world and things like drags and carries, we may very well shoot and use our gun in an active shooting situation or something like that, where there are injured people that need to get helped or moved, or our families, we got a toddler we got to pick up. We've got, lots of things like that. So I very well might need to, with a sense of urgency, put my gun away to then start working other problems with both my hands. But that still can be done methodically. It's just like with shooting, where we don't necessarily want to tell people to go slower. Like, we need you to go fast. So you need to be able to do it at a certain speed. So telling people, hey, slow down, doesn't really help them in the long term. Same thing with reholstering. We need to be able to do it methodically. It can still happen at a relatively fast rate, but as long as we're aware of what's going on, we can see our holster, all that kind of stuff. That's how I kind of approach the holster problem. But yeah, there's a ton of this. I mean, so in this vehicle class that I took, so it's called vehicle CQB, which is close quarters battle. It's a term that we typically would use for things like room clearing. So SWAT teams going into houses or special operations raids, that is doing CQB, quote unquote. And Will Petty, the owner of the program, trademarked an idea called vehicle CQB, and everyone kind of was like, well, what does that mean? CQB is in houses, not around cars. What's going on? Well, we find the same principles of smart and dumb things to do in a house are similar smart and dumb things to do around vehicles. For example, we don't like to stand inside a doorway of a house. What we think of as a threshold. Standing in the middle of that, you don't have a lot of mobility left and right, and everyone in both rooms can see you. There's a bunch of disadvantages to being in a threshold. Same thing with cars, where if we stand in the doorway or something like that, the car isn't really offering us any protection, and we could, get shot a little easier. So we try to stay out of thresholds. There's a ton of commonalities of things that we do in structures that we would want to do around cars. So that was kind of the name of the class. But one of the myths we kind of talked through with vehicle ballistics is an area that there's a ton of myths about. I've heard people say things like, bullets will zip right through a car, and, cars are not cover, which is a common one that we hear. Older cars stop bullets better than newer cars. That's a myth that's been out there for a while. And yeah, we get to kind of unpack all that. We did a live fire ballistics demo on a car to see what parts of it will and will not stop a bullet. So that's a big one that some people have heard from, again, their uncle who was a cop in 1986, that they're still carrying into class today.
Absolutely. Yes. And I would like to transition to vehicle talk a little bit more. So this is perfect. When it comes to kind of the top, this may be a silly question, but the top 5 positions that you need to maybe work as a civilian, can you even choose 5? If you can,
sure.
what would those maybe be?
That's so that's a great question. When we look at positioning around cars, that's also kind of a common myth that we see. So if we look at the vehicle, it's, we know what it looks like, right? We have what we call the long axis of the car. So from the engine through the cab and then into the trunk. And then the short axis would be across the passenger compartment of the engine block. Your positioning is going to be based on wherever the angle of your threat is, right? This position or that position may be better or worse, but ultimately we're trying to get most of the car between us and wherever the bad guy is. If the bad guy was to move left or right, we have to move left or right with him to, again, keep the car between us. A common myth that we hear is that the engine block is an ideal place to use for cover when we need to fight around vehicles. So again, that would typically be thought of as the short axis of the car. So we'd be either on the driver or the passenger side by the engine block, taking a knee with that engine block between us and the adversary. That, like, literally for like so many people, you just get to the engine block, only the engine block, the engine block, the engine block. Well, the engine block is good cover, meaning that it will reliably stop bullets from hitting you, right? That's not a bad thing. We never want to give that up. But in terms of the positioning of you that's required to get the engine block between you and the bad guy, we find people have to get into very, very compromised positions. They either have to take a very, very low knee or sometimes a double kneeling position and really contort their body into this little scrunched up ball to really put that engine block between them and a bad guy at the ranges that we're talking about. If the guy's 100 yards away, I might be able to take a normal kneeling position, right? But if he's 5 yards away, I have to really get low to get that engine block between me and him. So the positioning aspect of that actually makes the engine block not that great of a place to be. So the centrifuge model, the centrifuge training model is being data driven, meaning they'll look at large studies or study a lot of videos of shootings to figure out what is typically working and not working. What are some trends that we can notice about success and failure? And one of the data points they have is from all the vehicle gunfights that they have studied, which is many hundred. I think it's several thousand actually. 68% of the people who win fighting around a car win from the rear of the vehicle. Only 32% win from the front of the vehicle. There's a ton of reasons why, but you'd think the person at the front has a better piece of cover. And that may be true. The engine block is going to stop bullets, right? But that person's sacrificing so much mobility. They're sacrificing so much visibility and situational awareness to contort themselves into this weird position to get that engine block that it doesn't work out well for them. What we find typically is being at the rear of the vehicle on the long axis is the ideal position to be around a car. That could be either behind the driver's side or the passenger side, so not directly in the middle of the car, but offset to the side a little bit, to the right or left. Those two positions are kind of plan A. Reason being is we get to stay pretty upright, so we can either be at a full standing position if we had something like an SUV, or we might have to squat down a little bit if we had like a sedan. We get to shoot around the side of the car versus over the car, which has a lot of drawbacks, basically, which I can go into if you want. But we get to shoot around the side of the car. We get to stay upright. We have as much distance between us and the adversary as possible. We do look at marksmanship and stuff like that. Typically, the good guys are better trained and have better marksmanship than bad guys. So distance is our friend. And you still end up having the engine block between you and the other guy too, if you wanted to take a knee or something like that. So, yeah, a lot more that goes into that, but plan A is long axis at the driver, behind the driver or passenger side frame. And then other positions we need to be able to know how to work, but they're all less than ideal. And they're just going to be based on the angle to the threat, right? We need to know how to work off the engine block. Ideally, again, my preference is shooting around stuff, not over stuff. So rather than shooting over the engine block, we would prefer to shoot around the front of the radiator in front of the hood. So that's another position to work in the triangle. So the triangle is, that place where you have an open driver or passenger side door. You've got the side of the car, that little space that you'd stand in between the door and the car. We call the triangle or the V. That's not a great place to be, but we end up there quite a bit. So that's not a position of advantage, but there's a very, very high number of civilian self-defense situations that happen in that space. So we do need to know how to work from there too. So yeah, I think those would be a couple that I would try out and figure out. I mean, this is great stuff that you can do in dry practice too with your own vehicle and say, hey, if I needed to use my engine block for cover and I drive a BMW sedan, how low do I have to get really to get that engine block between me and whatever be over there? Try the rear of the vehicle, see how it is, in the V. I would try all those out.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot of ranges, especially if you go to an outdoor range that's usually part of like a smaller gun club where you can drive your car up as far as you want to. So that's what just came to mind for me.
Yep.
As far as someone wanting to work that, is that where you would kind of recommend they go and drill?
Certainly.
That?
Yeah, I don't really steer people towards using their own car for live fire, mainly because the consequences of a little whoopsie are pretty high, right? And it's very, very common to shoot a vehicle inadvertently when we're really Really trying to aggressively use it for cover. We're trying to minimize our exposure as much as possible. I have a reel that's on deck for my Instagram that's going to be coming out soon. And I use disposable vehicles, in my classes, not even vehicle based classes. So in pistol performance, where we go through cover and concealment, we talk through vehicle dynamics, even without it being a vehicle tactics class, just because they're such a ubiquitous thing in our world. And I have a video of a dude. He shoots out my back window in the middle of a drill, and I'm quite upset. And it's not great. It's a disposable car. It's okay. It's not the end of the world, but I was less than pleased. And I'm a nice guy, as you can tell. I was less than pleased. So.
No, that's totally fair. So.
Yeah.
Are there some that have windows and some that don't? How does that?
Yeah. Yep. So I have several vehicles at the outdoor training facility that I teach at that are specific to Odyssey. They're Odyssey property. No one else uses them. We have one that doesn't run, and we use it as a shoot car. So all the windows have been shot out. The windshield's been shot out. We've done a lot of ballistics demos in that Utah Performance Expo that I was mentioning a while ago. Mm-hmm. I taught intro to vehicle defense in the last, in the spring expo. So everyone got the opportunity to shoot a vehicle with their concealed carry load, typical, grain weight and hollow point bullet. They shot through the engine block, they shot through a pillar, and then they shot through, an open space. So a door, the trunk, things like that, and got to see how likely is it that your rounds will go through a car. I think if I do the math right, everybody shot 3 rounds. So that's 75 impacts ish, around 75 impacts to the car. And I think we had about 10 get through. So when people say cars are not covered, you hear that, oh, cars aren't covered, bullets will zip right through a car. It's like, well, not according to this demonstration and like a whole ton of ballistics testing that's been happening for decades. But even, pistol rounds through a door or something like that, when you look at the vehicle, it's not just a door. The bullet has to get through the door, often something like a seat or a center console or a car seat that might be in the back of the car or something like, any extra grocery bags, like there's typically stuff in there, and then through another door. So that's quite a bit of material that a little pistol bullet has got to find its way through. So that car's been all shut up. And then I have another car that runs, that's kind of my mobile range trailer. So it's stacked full of target stands and targets and sticks and steel and all that. And I just drive it to whichever range I'm going to be shooting at. And, that car has not been shot up that much. It's disposable, right? I got it for free. It was a gift, all this. We actually talk about how I got that. It was a funny story, but, so he shot out the back window of that. Yeah. I'm so sorry. It was the only reason I got the nice car was because the other car got shot up without my permission and without me there and by people who should not have been shooting cars. No. So that was less than fun. Yeah. I got a good friend of mine who, his car got totaled. Right. And he was like, hey, my car's totaled. Do you want it for range training? I got rear-ended a little bit. The car's still in great shape. All that. So we towed it out to the range and used it for my training. It was labeled, all that kind of stuff. And then like 3 weeks later, I came and taught a class and I look over and all the windows are shot out. The windshield's been shot through a bunch. The mirrors have been shot off, all that kind of stuff. So I was just like, rage. No, not rage.
Oh my God, I don't blame you. It was just strangers?
It was not strangers. It's a members only facility. So we know,
got it.
It's not a public range, right? So we investigated and found out, that there was a big training organization. I'm not going to say their name, but they're an extremely big human trafficking nonprofit, that their name is in the news a lot nowadays. And they're a very, very big organization. They were doing a kind of client appreciation event or donor appreciation event with their high level donors where they got to come out and bring their instructor in and do a bunch of drills. And that instructor he was a traveling instructor, not from that facility, and said, hey, free car. Let's have everyone shoot the car up. So, they apologized, they compensated me and they got me a new car. So they certainly made it right. but
Yeah.
it was kind of, it was kind of that like, hey, don't do that. Right.
Right.
So that's how I got the second car. So
Yeah.
with no initial investment on the Odyssey side, I got two cars.
That's awesome.
So yeah, you'll see the reel. But one of the big problems we have with shooting around cars, and this is a cover and concealment thing in general anyways, is sight offset, right? Or height over bore. There's different terms for it, but the difference between where you see your sights and the muzzle of the gun and where the bullets physically come out of the gun. For a handgun with iron sights, that's like 1/4 of an inch, right? Not much. With a red dot, you're starting to get towards 1/2 inch. Sometimes depending on the mounting solution of the red dot, you might even be at like 3/4 of an inch. And then with rifles, it's, 2.5, 3 inches, all that's very significant offset between the bullets and the sights. So when we use things like barricades for cover, it's very common that people will lean out. They'll put their sights on the target. They can see the target, but their barrel is still being obstructed by the barricade. Pop a round off and they shoot the barrel or the piece of plywood or whatever you're using for cover. And it happens with cars all the time. So that's one of the reasons that we like those sides of the cars versus the top of the car, or the top of the hood or something like that, is because now we don't have to, if I'm shooting around the side and I'm using cover correctly, my sights and my muzzle will leave the cover and into open space at the same time versus my sights being exposed, but not my muzzle, which is how that dude shot the car. He did it incorrectly. Right. If only there was an instructor there telling him, hey, don't do that.
Right.
Kablam.
Né he'll probably never do it again, just out of sheer embarrassment.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's part of play this game long enough and you're going to see stuff happen, right? It's just, I've had people who are professional instructors for decades. They've seen every weird thing happen on the range, and it all is just it's all part of the game. Grace to him. Not from me, but from someone else.
Right. Yes. No, that's completely understandable. Absolutely. Yeah. Are you in search of top-notch gear that exceeds your expectations? Look no further than GPS, brought to you by Go Outdoors Incorporated. GPS has been dedicated to crafting the finest products for hunting and shooting since 2002. As someone who frequents the gun range, my GPS bag is a staple to safely and effectively haul my gear. Their specialized bags are designed to keep all of my valuable equipment secure and organized. With GPS, you can experience the ultimate peace of mind. There are 3 exciting product lines: GPS Tactical, GPS Wild About Hunting, and GPS Wild About Shooting provide the perfect solution for your specific needs. So whether you're on a hunting expedition or hitting the range, GPS is your reliable companion. To choose a bag that fits your needs, use code SheetShield at checkout to save and to support the pod. That's SHESHIELD at checkout. Yeah, and I love that you're bringing attention to vehicle tactics, even though you're not teaching the course quite yet. I feel like it's always good to allude to like what else is out there in your training. What should you be thinking about? And I'm sure that will give you a lot of return on future clientele. So that's
totally. And it's a relatively, vehicle class is not your first class, right? You need to be pretty squared away on quite a lot of things to go to a vehicle class. So that's not a basic course. But the problem with I think you had Guy Schnitzler on recently, right? And we talked about an industry and what an industry is, and is this a real industry, right? But the problem with our training world, whatever word you want to use, Guy's a good friend of mine. He and I took Craig Douglas's knife class together, so I haven't seen him in quite a while, but he's a very good dude. And in our world, what happens is, for those specialized classes, right? They get marketed as very unique. They get marketed as very advanced, and they're typically taught by people who are military veterans or police SWAT veterans, and they have a wealth of experience, right? They have been there and they have done that, and that's really, really important. But they aren't teaching. They're taking what they did in Iraq in 2005. And applying it to Salt Lake City in 2023. And it's just not the same. There are certain principles, right? There are certain truths that always pervade everything. But taking what it looked like for you and just cookie cuttering applying that to another context, I don't think works very well. So, you'll see people take a 2-day vehicle defense class, a normal training nerd, right? He's been to a bunch of classes and he goes to a 2-day vehicle defense class. And, throughout the class, he is wearing body armor and a plate carrier, and he has a rifle and a duty belt with a handgun in a big outside the waistband holster. And he's doing break contact drills like a convoy would if they got disabled in convoy operations, and how to get wounded people out of the back seat, and how to do all these different things, throwing smoke grenades and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, that's just not training for your context. It's not a bad thing. We're all allowed to have fun on the range, but that doesn't apply, So the classes that I've tried to take have all focused on, civilian with a handgun. How do you draw from concealment in the driver's seat, right? That takes some minutia, right? That takes some training. And if we can give people that training in their proper circumstance, their proper situation that they're going to face, I think we're going to equip people for success really well. And again, whether it's a smart thing, this is one of the things where you always hear people say, don't fight around cars. Just get away from the car. The car is not covered. Just get away from the car. Well, the problem is, how do you get away from the cars in a Walmart parking lot? Like, it's 50 yards of cars in every direction. So turning your back and sprinting and going, I'm getting away from the cars. I'm doing what I was told. And just getting tagged, getting tagged in the back. That's not a solution, right? So how we can equip people for success is really important to me. And I think we'll be able to do that pretty well. So, I think, there's no class that I've ever taken that I've ever taken and said, I would teach it exactly that way, with exactly that drill and exactly that verbiage and exactly that timing for anything. I always look at it, okay, if I was going to teach that, what would I change? What would I change? What would I do differently? What would I add to it? And I think that's just part of being a good instructor, is you should be able to know, how would I make that mine and unique, right? Otherwise you're just, kind of copying someone else's homework.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I think sometimes people also absorb and understand things differently, if it's said differently. So if someone were to go to that course and then go to yours, even though it's similar material, they may get more from it. So that makes total sense. I probably could have said that a little bit better, but no, that makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to fighting from inside the car, I feel like lately my TikTok For You page has been all about car situations. What are some common kind of situations like people get into when having to deploy their weapon in a car?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a big can of worms. I'm just gonna full disclosure. This is like the controversial thing that I see people argue about on the Instagram, because there's people that teach it and they're like, yep, you got to know how to shoot from inside the car. And then I see a bunch of very good instructors, right? Very high level people with real world experience be like, that's the dumbest thing you can ever do. Never do that. You're taking people's money. You're wasting training time. It's dangerous. Like, never do it. So wait till everyone gets in their camps and it's all going to be great in the comments section of whatever. So first we have to establish the need, right? Is there a situation where you are attacked with a lethal threat while you're seated in the vehicle? Answer's obviously yes. So one of the data points from Centrifuge is when we look at police officers who are ambushed. So they are not ending a vehicle pursuit. They're not arresting someone. They're not doing anything, like answering a call. They're just doing their thing, driving around or, walking around doing their own activity. 37% of all officers who are ambushed while not answering a call for service are ambushed while seated in the patrol vehicle. So that's over 1 in 3, right? It's over a third of officers who are ambushed are sitting in the patrol car when the ambush occurs. So that's not all the time, right? But that is very relatively common, right? More than 1 in 3. When we look at the civilian side, we also know there's a very, very common occurrence of people being carjacked, right? We literally have a term for being attacked around your car. It's called a carjacking, or being robbed or beaten up while seated in the vehicle. That's a very, very common place to get attacked as well. So there certainly is a need there. On the officer side for law enforcement, not just being ambushed, but we also have a high occurrence of traffic, high-speed chases ending with immediate resistance. So that's not an ambush, right? The officer's engaged. He knows what's going on. He's driving his car. He's trying to, knock this guy off the road. Like he's not clueless, right? But the chase ends, the car crash happens, kabam, kabam, kabam. And that dude gets out with a gun and starts shooting in all the cars, right? So he is currently seated in his vehicle. He's not being ambushed, right? But he is seated in his vehicle with an immediate lethal threat. So, the need is certainly there. There is a threat there. You see people say that is an unsolvable problem. That has been said out there, is that there really isn't anything you could train that would significantly change the outcome of trying to fight from the front seat, right? Where there's just so many limitations to trying to fight from inside the vehicle that you couldn't train anything well. And those limitations do exist. You're seated, right? So your equipment is harder to access. Your gun can be kind of pinned in, maybe even by the seatbelt or something like that. You can't move, right? You're currently stuck in a box, right? Which is not fun. You can't see as well, right? So we've all had that situation where we're making like the right hand turn and we're looking around. We don't see any pedestrians and we move our head a little bit, and behind the pillar near your driver or passenger side, there was a person right there, right? People get obstructed by the vehicle. So you can't see as well. And then also when we look at the windshield, is actually a really big problem. Bullets are altered in their trajectory very significantly when they strike a windshield. It's very strong, sturdy glass, laminate glass. And when it's raked backwards for aerodynamic capability of the vehicle and stuff, like a sports car has a very severe rake to the windshield. A Jeep or a Humvee has not that much rake, or how slanted the windshield is. If the rounds are outside the car and coming in through the windshield, they're redirected downwards pretty significantly, which means that even if that dude is kind of just shooting the rounds kind of anywhere, and they're all being redirected downwards into your chest, your lap, your legs, all those kinds of things, because your body is underneath the windshield. So that is working against you. When we look at shooting out of the windshield, the same thing, the opposite occurs, where rounds are redirected upwards very significantly when they strike vehicle glass from the inside out. Which means if I was going to draw my gun and try to shoot a dude through a windshield, my rounds are going to be flying into the air very, very fast. Unless that dude is literally right up on the bumper, it's very likely to just go over his head. So a lot of problems, right? That's not all of that's working against you. Not a great place to be. But we know the need is there. People get attacked there. And there are ways to overcome some of those limitations. So an example would be things like with windshields, we have a procedure called porting a windshield, where if I was going to try and shoot a dude through an obstruction like that, or any other obstruction, car door, something like that, rather than trying to shoot him with one round at a time, I'm going to shoot one round at him. That's going to create a hole in the barricade. And then I'm going to try and drive every other round through that hole. And that will minimize the influence or the interaction of the barricade on the remaining rounds. So if I could shoot 6 rounds through the same hole, that first 1 or 2 may be deviated. After that, everything else is striking true. So, and that's a way to mitigate that, right? So all of that to say, fighting from the front seat sucks. It would never be plan A. We wouldn't be like, all right, so we're going to do the tactical operation. Alpha team's going to go left. Bravo team's going to go right. Charlie team, we're going to have all you guys just sit in your patrol cars and then point your guns to the windshield, and it's going to work out great for you, right? Like that wouldn't be plan A.
Right.
But we get attacked there. So like it or not, we can either say it's an unsolvable problem and you're going to die, or we can work towards how do we mitigate things like being trapped in a seatbelt or how to, port a windshield, all that kind of stuff. I think those things are important. I think that that's worth some training time to figure out, mainly because if we look at the problem from, if we kind of back our way into the problem, we find that people are attacked in their vehicle all the time, but not all of them are dying. People are successful at doing something. We just got to figure out what that is and train it, right? It's not 100% fatality rate. And there are people that are doing well at fighting from the front seat. And there's minutia about how that works. It's not intuitive. It's not natural. So it does take some training time. It's not an entire class by any means, right? We would never, do an entire class from fighting from the front seat just because it sucks so much. But it is worth some training time. So when we look at deploying a gun inside a car, we really want a couple tips that are really going to help is deconflicting your muzzle, right? Thinking about where your legs are on the draw, whether that's from a strong side hip position, or this is actually an advantage to appendix carry, is as soon as the gun clears the holster, if we torque our wrist and torque the muzzle away, just kind of like you do with a reholster, right? Where the muzzle's slightly away. If we do the same thing in reverse on the way out, the moment the gun pops out of the holster, it's directly between our legs and then already up, and we never actually point it at our thighs or abdomen or anything like that. So that's one of the reasons I carry appendix. But gun pops out, want to try and get the gun as close to the windshield as possible. That's a good tip. If you had to shoot through a windshield, we wouldn't want to shoot from super far away. It just makes it harder to get all those rounds through the same hole, right? And then if we don't have to sit in the vehicle, we're going to improve our position and get out as fast as possible. That's if you're going to make the decision to try and fight from inside the car, as soon as you have the opportunity to get out, we're going to get out. Here's the thing though, when we look at the data, the most dangerous place to be in that whole procedure is on exit. If we are exiting under opposition, that is very, very commonly the place where dudes get tagged. So we're not going to exit until we have the opportunity, right? We build that opportunity by good gunfire of the bad guy. So example of this from the civilian context. So I'm currently building a database of civilian self-defense gunfights in video format. So it's a big old Excel spreadsheet, and video comes in, assign the video a number, and then link it and then analyze it for, I think I have 115 different data points on the video. So, was it in low light? Did someone use a handheld flashlight? Did someone use a weapons mounted flashlight? You can start to add how many rounds were fired. What was the hit ratio? How far away were the rounds fired at? Did anyone slip and fall? Were they able to regain their footing? And one of those is was the person attacked inside the vehicle? Did they shoot from inside the car out? All that kind of stuff. And one of the videos I just analyzed this week actually was a situation. It was a follow home invasion. So husband and wife are in their car. Guy's driving. Wife is in the passenger seat. They drive into their garage and close the garage door. And as that garage door is closing, 3 dudes armed with pistols snatch the bottom of the garage door, lift it up, all enter the garage for a home invasion. As bad guy number 1. So quick aside, that's one of the reasons why I enjoy backing into whatever garage, parking space, driveway you have, is because it gives you visibility outwards while you're parking versus sticking yourself in a box with your head forward. So just a little tip.
Yes.
As that initial bad guy is approaching the driver's side door, he's got a handgun in his hand. He opens up the driver's side door, pokes the gun in. Hey man, this is a robbery. All that. That's his plan. Get in the house, jewelry, phones, all that. The driver, the guy, saw someone approaching, saw what was happening, saw the garage door get lifted, saw somebody approaching him through that side mirror, and in the vehicle was able to get his handgun out, shift his hips to the left so that he was oriented towards the door. And at that exact same moment, the door opens by the bad guy, and he's fighting from the front seat, again, in a seated position, stuck in his car at 1 yard from the bad guy, facing a muzzle. Super, super bad place to be, right? We would never call that plan A, right, but that's a really common place people end up. he fires 12 rounds. I think he hits 8 or 9 of them. Bad guy fires 3 rounds at him, doesn't hit any of them. Dudes all run off. He saves the day, saves his wife, all that kind of deal. So he had to deploy a gun from a seated position in a car, right? He had to exit a car while firing. Again, that's a dangerous place to be, right? But he's able to buy the opportunity to exit because he fired his first 3 rounds from a seated position and then was able to get out and continue the fight. And I think that speaks well to the fact that there is a way to win at this. We just need to train it. And if we can train it, it's going to work well. That's a very long-winded answer. Sorry.
Oh my gosh. I appreciated every bit of it. So I'd like to know, and I know it's hard to visualize it without the video, but you did a really good job. When you say the first perp like shot at him 3 times and nothing hit him, did the door stop it, or did he just have terrible aim?
Terrible aim. Yep.
Wonderful.
So if you know a guy named John Correa, he runs a company called Active Self Protection, big YouTube channel. That's where I got the video from. It's linked, I've got his licensing and stuff like that, and it's linked to my database. So he has what he calls the FIBS factor, FIBS, fudge, I've been shot, right? When the FIBS factor arrives in a fight, that's when everybody scampers off. So you see it in criminals all the time where, oh my gosh, this guy's got a gun. I just got shot. And they run away. So you see it in super slow motion as he opens the door and sticks his revolver into the driver's compartment and sees a muzzle coming right back up at him and pop, pop, pop. He literally, like, you see a kid with like a super soaker, like a water gun, and you're spraying a kid with a hose, and they do the whole like kind of scamper away from you. They try to run off as fast as they can. That's what that dude did. He fired 3 rounds, not looking at his gun, not looking at the bad guy, literally behind his body, as he was kind of, oh my gosh, as he's getting hit. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank God that's why.
That's a
I
win.
thought maybe that was, yeah. And I love that you are building a database. Is this something you're wanting to offer to the public at some point, or is it for your classes?
It's probably going to be something that my clients get access to if you go through my training progression, right? But it's probably not going to be open source. It's as you could imagine, not a small amount of work to
of course
analyze a video and try to figure out what's going on and read news stories and figure out, okay, they said in the police report that they shot this many times. You gotta hunt down a lot of information. But for the Odyssey curriculum needs to be built on something more than, I think this was a good idea, or I heard this in somebody else's class, right? We can look at those national trends. Centrifuge is a data-driven company, and they've got a database and stuff like that. As an instructor graduate, I have access to their Dropbox link, which has a ton of videos and data and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's law enforcement centric. There's still some commonality, certainly, with civilians, but it is not a civilian database. So I've said I'll build my own. So as you can tell, I'm kind of a nerd about a lot of things. So it's just an outlet for my nerdery.
I think you're the first, at least from what I've collected, instructor that's come on the podcast to be so data driven. And that might be because we haven't had an opportunity with other instructors. I know this is like our 3rd episode, but pretty much every time I ask you a question, you come back with data. So I appreciate that, especially with my medical background and biochem background. Data was the only way.
Data matters, right? You should be able to understand, a research paper, right? Like, I think that should be a requirement to, again, we're talking about something that's very, very serious, right? Like, having the wrong answer, equipping someone poorly, that's not a place I ever want to be, right? So
absolutely,
it's a high level of trust that our students give us to say, hey, you teach me about this and it's going to matter, right? If it's not going to matter, right? It's like, hey, I'm just here to have fun. That's okay, right? We're all allowed to have fun with guns. That's not a problem, but that's just not how I've built my classes, right? So, yeah. So that's gonna continue to expand. I've already got like a bunch of just studies that we've talked about and all that kind of stuff. My staff instructors have access to them. And it's helping them kind of research and figure out. Some of them, the guys that I've got working with me range from, kind of brand new to shooting, been working in the gun world for a while, but are kind of newer to concealed carry and stuff like that, to, state level competitive shooters that are, just technical experts in performance shooting, right? And they're we got martial artists, we got all that kind of stuff, and EMTs, we've got everything. So all of that we can kind of put together, and if we can all get on the kind of same page with how this stuff works, we can have a really good program.
Absolutely. And I can already see some really cool content coming from that database, like you just showing like a piece of it, like in this particular situation, especially with those kind of mythical and also just straight up BS comments you get, and kind of coming at
when people say, "Hey, this will never work," or FBI. You ever heard the? Here's another myth. So you heard the FBI statistics to say that the average gunfight happens at 3 yards in 3 seconds with 3 rounds fired, or you ever heard anything like that?
I've heard people use the FBI as like a as a source.
If you just ask them what part of the FBI does data analysis, you get nothing but crickets. It's like FBI agents aren't statisticians. Like, what part of the FBI came like, and it's no one knows what it like. There's I just heard it in my concealed carry class. And it's like, okay, right. So that's a really good, interesting point too. So, the FBI does collect data. The two primary sources for us are the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, and LEOCA, LEOKA, the Law Enforcement Officers Killed and Assaulted. They're both great databases. I really like the UCR database for civilians. It shows a lot of just crime trends. So you figure out how often they've got the it's called the Crime Data Explorer on their website, where you can plug in all violent crime in Utah in the last 10 years, or in only 2021, or whatever, and you can see how often were firearms used, how often were knives used. You can see the gender disparity is how often is it a male versus a female, all that kind of stuff. How often is the perpetrator known to the victim, right? Which is a very interesting one to see in Utah in the last 10 years. If I remember my data correctly, it's about 49% of all violent crime is perpetrated by somebody that we know, some kind of acquaintance, family member, spouse, all that kind of stuff. It's very, very high. So, so looking at like gunfight data, right? People always, reference the FBI. What they typically reference is the LEOCA database, Law Enforcement Officers Killed and Assaulted. That one's really interesting because I was playing around with it recently, and I had always heard, so this is how we learn stuff, right? I've been giving out wrong information. Okay. So I had always heard that law enforcement hit rates in gunfights were somewhere in the teens, 18%, 17%, 15%, something like that. Very, very low. That's 1 in 6 rounds are actually hitting the target. And I was like, man, that sucks. Right. And, these were from big name instructors that I had taken classes with that said that in their class. They're like, yep, like here's the hit ratios, all that kind of deal. Well, I dived into the databases and found out they have 2 different databases, one for officers killed in the line of duty and one for officers assaulted in the line of duty, but survived. So we lost, or we had a hard situation, but we won. 2 different data sets. When you look at officers who are killed in the line of duty, typically their hit rate is in the 15%, 18%, depending on what year you look at. It's very, very low. You also see a very high percentage of officers who don't even fire their weapon. So that skews the data a little bit because they get assassinated, right? They just get killed. They never even get their chance to get their hand on the gun, right? So that skews the data a little bit there. When you look at officers assaulted but survived, their hit rates are well over, they're in like the high 30s. So 38, 34, stuff like that. So over 1 in 3. That's double, right? So if we look at, hey, the winners are actually scoring a lot more hits than, well, it's only 15%. It's like, yeah, and they're losing. right? It's not a good data point to teach off of. So that's how I had to learn. I was like, oh, it's only the guys that are killed have a hit ratio of 15%. You got to look at the other database. So once you start to dive in, and really spend the time and invest the time to figure out what's going on, that's when you can come to better answers. The database I have right now, it's not very big. I'm kind of just starting out. It's all civilians, right? Or off-duty cops, so still operating in they got robbed, right? Exactly like a civilian would. So you kind of think about that as a civilian with some training. So we have a data point on whether or not training matters, were they trained? How was their hit rate versus they didn't show any level of training? What's their hit rate? But right now, the hit rates that I'm looking at are in the 75% range, 75 to 80% hit rate. So that's super high, right? That's awesome. If we can hit at 80%, that's great. Right. So yeah, that's a bunch of data.
Are these absolutely? I'd love to hear it. Are these databases available to the public, like anyone?
They are. Yeah. They're on there. If you, the easiest one to start playing around with is the UCR. If you want to look at statistics, that's where I recommend you start. The Crime Data Explorer is super easy to use. It's very user friendly. All that kind of stuff. Leoka, you can get your hands on. They're in different, you just gotta have to search around the FBI's website and stuff like that. And they have them kind of broken out by year. So they're not really easy to okay, I want the last 10 years. Well, that's 10 Excel spreadsheets that I got to copy paste or something. So they're not as easy. But the UCR is a great place to start.
Wonderful. Yeah. I would love to look into that. And just the other day, I saw a woman on TikTok post her experience of, being in a parking lot, feeling unsafe. And there's, of course, someone in the comments saying you're more likely to be harmed owning a gun than you are, having to defend yourself.
Right.
Without one, kind of thing. And that's one of those statistics, right? That's so general. There's almost no context. And there were also comments that was like pew pew, or that said things like pew pew, or get a gun, girl, something like that. I like to comment things like, hey, DM me on Instagram, love to chat with you about if you want a little bit of consulting here. But I also try to be careful because you can only use so much. It inflicts so much tone in your comments, and I never want to seem like I'm shaming someone. Like, geez, girl, you need a gun. Like, why didn't you have a gun?
DM me, you need some help here. Yeah.
Yes, stuff like that. So if they seem like they want help, it's usually like they'll say something at the end, like, I don't know, do you all use any apps or any advice? And that's when I'm like, DM me or something. So
totally.
But yeah, anyway, back to the comment though. That's a really common one I see on all platforms.
All the time, right? Yeah. And there's almost like there's data on that too.
What? Okay.
You're making me. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He's a sociologist, and I think his last name starts with an S. I could definitely look it up. But he did some studies back in the late 90s and into the 2000s on defensive gun uses, right? How often does a civilian use a firearm to protect themselves? That data it's hard to nail down, right? Because it's really underreported. There's plenty of people who use a firearm successfully to protect themselves and never report it. You can think of stuff like domestic violence situations where the woman goes and gets a gun and he backs off, right? But she doesn't report that anywhere. So they happen quite a bit, but they're also really hard to define for a statistical model. If you think of something like, I get robbed at a gas station, I get my gun out, I shoot the bad guy, and he dies from those wounds, right? That is a homicide. It's going to go in the homicide statistics. Same situation. As I'm getting my gun out, he sees it and runs off. No rounds fired, no injuries sustained, but I still protected myself with my gun, right? So the disparity in the numbers is really, really wide. I think his data used to still be on the CDC's website. The CDC does keep some data on defensive gun uses, but I think it was certainly in the last year, maybe in the last 6 months, they deleted quite a bit of it. It's just it doesn't fit the narrative politically, unfortunately. So all of that data is no longer in public access, which sucks because you're like, you took the evidence of reality and said it doesn't fit a political narrative and took it away and said all this is gone, right?
Right.
But the disparities are wide in the numbers. The lowest number that's pretty reliable for defensive gun uses in the U.S. nationally is 300,000 a year. So 300,000 times a good person has a firearm, and something bad could have happened, and it didn't because they had that gun. We have about 40 or 50,000 gun deaths in the U.S. a year, so fatalities with firearms. I think about 20 or 30,000 of those are suicides. About half are suicides. So 300,000 times a year, somebody has a gun, does something good with it, and bad things stop happening. 20 to 30,000 times a year, a bad person has a gun and kills someone with it. Or there's an accident, and that also includes accidents, all that kind of stuff. So the disparity is huge, right? The guns absolutely are a good thing to have in society. They reduce the crime rate by a huge margin, and they definitely changed the landscape of crime in the U.S. to the positive very, very significantly. But yeah, that's another one that kind of floats around, right? And that comes from other places that have a narrative, right? They're trying to spin an anti-gun thing. And, one of them was saying, is concealed carry good? Like, do people concealed carrying guns actually defend themselves? And their number was 500 a year. 500 times a year is concealed carry successful. Their criteria for that was a person had to draw the gun, fire it, the person had to die, that person then had to be charged with a crime and use a self-defense in court. That's how far that had to go. Exactly.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It's like, they're always like, this is only happening a couple hundred times a year. All these people want to carry guns.
Right.
Like, well, you defined it the strictest way you could possibly define it. So,
right.
You're getting me all riled up, Sophie. Come on.
Well, we're talking about this. We didn't even discuss this. And this is so, I'm so thankful for this, because I feel like I could just throw almost this episode out as a reference, because you've mentioned, in this one episode about 5 database references,
right.
Which
and that's important. Like if you're an instructor, don't just take my word for it, right? I am not the final arbiter of these things by any means, right? I'm a human being. Right. I misremember stuff. Look it up on your own. If you want to use, I use data in my classes. The whole first 15 minutes of my concealed carry class for to get issued your permit is what I call defining the problem. And it's all of, is crime, do you even need a gun, right? Is crime that big a deal? We go through all the data on that. We go through the data of, okay, well, here's what violent assaults typically look like we define them by a couple of numbers-based criteria. We use those databases and say, hey, here is and then we look at some videos and say, here is the problem we're trying to solve. That defines every other question of what brand of gun should you carry? How much ammo should I have? All this stuff. And it's it's all defined off a problem that we need to define. So, I enjoy doing that. I think people get a good, get benefit out of having the problem actually examined versus just saying, well, it'll be let's say it's a robbery. Well, what does robbery look like? So, that's just my deal.
Yes. And I appreciate you going into detail, and you've cited your sources. So if anyone wants to look into that further, they absolutely can. I will link everything in my show notes, and I'll probably not look at these databases tonight because I'll need to go to sleep at some point, and I'm not sure I'll be able to. Sounds so interesting, and I'm a sponge right now, and at this point in my career, I could very easily just look like an expert on social media and just talk like one, but I really only just share my experiences, and I try to put disclaimers everywhere, just little pop-ups, and make sure people
and that's good awareness, right? We all want to stay in our lane, right? Is the term.
Yes.
And that's good awareness to know, here's what I do know, and here's what I'm learning about, right? I try to do the same thing, where I had thoughts on vehicle tactics for a long time before I started to really talk about them and put them out and teach classes on it and all that kind of stuff, because I wanted to take more training and more research, right? There's controversial stuff about it. And some of the controversial guys are dudes that I know, they're friends of mine. They're either local, they're big name instructors. Right. And I was like, hey man, like, I don't know if that's 100%. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying, I don't know if that's the way we might need to structure it. Right. But I wasn't going to come out and say that without doing the research. Right. I think it's important to show your work, be able to show your work. Right. And that's with no matter what you're doing here. If you say, hey, here's how to shoot a gun real good. Guess what? If I show up on the line, shooter ready, stand by, I better see some good performance. Right. Be able to show your work.
Absolutely. So. Yes. I love that. I'm actually excited because I still have time before I give my first class. I have some time to pull up some of these stats. So that's great. And I can just see you. I know you don't have to do this. You may never do this, but I could totally see your website having some
the database.
Maybe you even have to pay for it. And then you can like refine your search to like what combination you want to see.
It's a great
so
point.
Cool.
Yeah, it'd be pretty cool. So yeah, what I have most of the videos are hashtagged with different key learning points, right? So that you can look up. I want to look up all.
Okay, very cool.
Let me just look at robberies, right? Let me look at multiple attackers. Let me look at shooters with training. Let me look at females. Let me look at all of that. And you can kind of separate out. So it's all in the works. It's all in the works, Sophie.
Oh, yeah.
World domination.
Absolutely.
Of the 9 people who would be interested in that.
No, I will make that 10 now. So
cool.
That's very cool. And then have you seen recently, this has kind of been trending, not like to do it, but the awareness around it, the little tags and indicators people or sex traffickers and criminals, not totally sure of all of the classifications of criminals, but are leaving on women's cars to like indicate they are like a single female traveling alone. Have you kind of looked into that? And been aware of that?
The kidnapping and trafficking world it's not an emerging threat. It's been around for a long time, but it's getting a lot more visibility and it's getting a lot bigger really quickly. So it's kind of this exponential curve of an increase in the threat. We kind of see it's very similar to active shooter, right? Active shooter has been around a long time, but more recently they're on an exponentially increasing curve. So active shooter training is just going to become more important, right? With the trafficking world, it's kind of the same thing where it is getting bigger and it's getting more complex and they're getting better at it at a rate faster than we can typically combat it. So it's a hard problem to solve. Ultimately, having the gun is that final solution, right? But yeah, so what you're talking about with tracking people in preparation for a kidnapping or for containment in some way, it does happen where you'll see people, they'll slip an air tag into a purse, they'll slip air tags into vehicles or onto vehicles and stuff like that, and be able to track that person's location in preparation to learn their routine. They can find a more advantageous spot to perform a kidnapping, all that. So it's funny. I didn't have that happen to me, but one of the things I actually learned about recently was your phone will alert you ideally when it starts to notice a pattern like that. Apple has technology in there that if they see certain Apple devices traveling with you that are not part of your profile, they'll let you know that there is an AirTag that is traveling with you. I recently went on an overseas trip, right, to Europe, and got that notification a couple of times of, hey, there's a set of AirPods that are traveling with you. And you're like, okay, well, it's AirPods. AirPods and an AirTag have the same technology in them in terms of the Find My Device stuff. So I was like, what's going on? And figured out it was my dad's AirPods, right? He's just been with me for 6 hours. We've gone from restaurant to bar to restaurant to bar, and now we're back at the hotel room. And they're like, hey, man, there's a set of AirPods that you haven't been more than 15 feet away from for 4 hours.
Right.
So that's interesting to know. And if you certainly ever got a notification like that, I would certainly take it seriously. Because that is a very common tactic is that. In terms of mitigation strategies, I wish I had a better answer. But that's something that we're going to have to understand as a risk. Situational awareness is super important, right? Understanding your own patterns and learning how to vary patterns, right, is important. But I wish that I could have like a RFID, eliminator for things around me or something like that. But it's just not what we have working with. But that's a big problem. Yeah, it's getting much bigger. I know the movie, The Sound of Freedom, right, is getting real popular nowadays. I don't know if you've seen it or not. I'll probably be seeing it. You have? Gotcha.
Yes, and it was very tastefully done. I just want to put that out there for anyone that's kind of like nervous to go see it. There aren't the graphic scenes I think some people were worried they would see. And I think that's important to note, especially for trigger warnings and stuff like that. I just kind of want to put that out there.
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet. It's on my to-do list here soon. But that movie's bringing a lot of attention to a very, very big problem. And hopefully, people will start to take things more seriously about, monitoring their kids' patterns, monitoring their kids' transportation to and from school. Internet access, we're kind of just tangenting, right? But man, I got a little 9-month-old baby girl, and looking at my wife and I planning out what her life is going to look like, it's taking a lot of this stuff into account, right? We all are scared of like that baby snatcher in the grocery store, and those happen, right? But looking at the data of the problem, grooming and trafficking through unrestricted online use is affecting, just huge percentiles of the youth population with a lot of really serious consequences. So definitely if you're that person, you're like your kids have their phones and iPads and all that kind of stuff in their bedrooms at night unrestricted, I'm going to go ahead and say that's probably a big problem. So yeah, we're trying to figure all that out. I'm a new dad. We're going to figure it out in time, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. She's already in really good hands. So I would love to know, this is the last question that I have, at least on me, but of course you always have really good points, even without prompts from me. So
gotcha. Feel
free. But I am curious, will you ever post pictures of your child on the internet?
Yeah. We've posted pictures of her, like, hey, she's 9 months old, and we do that. That's something that a lot of people are concerned about, right? That doesn't necessarily, there's some second and third order effects that can be harmful, but they're typically not harmful to the child, if that makes sense. So there's more that goes into that. But yeah, we do post her. We don't post her like all the time. We don't really send a lot of we can just kind of get into it. Things like bath time pictures and stuff like that. We don't send those over any electronic means, right? It's just, even I wouldn't send that to my family. I wouldn't send it to my mom of, hey, look how cute. It's just basically everything that goes through an electronic means is recorded, taken by people who shouldn't have it, and all that kind of stuff. So definitely would discourage that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's something my husband and I were talking about the other day, like the what ifs. And of course, that's going to look different. We don't plan on having kids for another 5 years. Hopefully. So, yeah. So, I'm sure it'll look even more different.
Yeah. Well, you've been married for like half an hour at this point, so you've got some time to.
That's so true. Yeah. I finally said husband though, without accidentally saying fiance first. So I do just want to pat myself on the back for that, because that has taken so long. So, but yeah, I really appreciate this topic. And if you ever get to a point where you maybe add that to part of your statistics, data collection, and I know you teach a situational awareness class. So if you have more questions come up in that class, and even have like a class one day about like family defense, something like that, I would love for you to come on and talk about that.
It's something that I'm diving more into. I use Craig Douglas's verbiage for it, but third party issues, right, this is a person that is either you're responsible for. It's not just you and a bad guy and nobody else, right? So like as an example, for the civilian rifle skills class that's coming out here at the end of the month, we're going to work through third party issues with a rifle, which is not typically covered, but how do you move and manage and manipulate another person while armed with a rifle, right? We see that a lot in home defense, right? Of how do you get people in or out of a house? We see it a lot in community defense of if you had to drag your wife out of, a storefront or something like that that's getting looted and move her a block to a safer area. How do you manage family, all that kind of stuff? You may have to do that physically, right? By grabbing people and moving them, or you might be able to command them. So we'll work through both options basically of how do you maybe come clear a given area, get them a good piece of cover and say, hey, come to me. All right. When I tell you to move, we're going to move to the next car, ready, move. You can do all that kind of stuff. In the situational awareness concepts class, we talk through a lot of third party issues because people come with their kids. I teach that class to kids quite a bit. And I got to take the profanity slide out of the PowerPoint. I got to, do all that. Try to be nice, Typically the kids cuss worse than me. So,
I was about to say, kids nowadays are like sailors.
Yeah, exactly. So, we talk about how are you going to have to, do something like managing unknown contacts, which you're familiar with. How do you arc? How do you get your fence? All of that while managing a toddler. Do you walk away from the toddler and draw attention elsewhere and get yourself in a more advantageous position? Do you attempt to anchor yourself to the toddler and they're maybe more protected, but you're not nearly as mobile? Pop quiz. What do you do, Sophie?
Oh, you're asking me. Oh,
yeah, I'm asking you.
So I would think that you would anchor exactly. All these flashbacks. I would think that you would anchor the toddler to you, but I'm also basing this on what I've seen on social media. So
okay, gotcha. And that's the thing is there's no right or wrong answer. It's situationally dependent, okay. Right? But in general, this is just
option C.
Option C. In general, like for me, I'm more of a fan of leaving people that are going to significantly detract from my ability to protect them somewhere that's safer, and I'll go somewhere more dangerous and deal with the problem. Versus the idea proximity doesn't mean safety. Just because they're hugging your leg doesn't mean they're safer, right? You getting taken down, knocked out, all of that makes them a whole lot less safe. So I might maintain better mobility, maintain better ability to fight, take impact, all that kind of stuff versus balancing all this stuff, right? Again, there's no one answer that solves every problem, but that's often what people don't see. We see this in terms of video database stuff. This is one of the ones I'm going to be working on soon is third-party failures. Basically, their inability to walk away from the shopping cart with a toddler in it and go manage a problem not stuck between two parked cars and a shopping cart behind you. If you could have stepped out, you probably could have dealt with that problem a lot better. But once you get beaten down, the kid has no safety anyways. So you may have to, it's kind of like put your own oxygen mask on first kind of stuff.
Right. Yes.
So something to think about a lot of it, because you talk about social media. It's a big question of how do I do, people are very new to self-defense, don't have any martial arts training. And like, how do I got 4 toddlers and I got to get groceries in the car. It's like, well, that's not going to go well without a security detail. I'm going to say that like you're going to do the best that you can with what you have, but giving people some options, can help them work through how it's going to fit well for their context.
Absolutely. I remember I think it may have been the first episode you came on for. You talked about how before you could throw, your groceries down, but now you have an infant, so you can't throw.
Yeah, you can't throw the infant down, right?
Mind blown. Even though that's a simple concept, it's like the things you have to learn as your life progresses and who you travel with changes.
Totally.
Wow.
You're totally right. Like a lot of people, I always drop my groceries, right? Oh, I never keep anything in my strong hand. I always carry my groceries in my left hand, that kind of deal. One of the things we actually went through, and you remember it. One of the things we went through in the centrifuge training class, we talked about inner limb coordination, which is a really big problem. Basically when people have an adrenal response, it's really hard for people to drop stuff. People crush grip multiple things, and they don't want to let stuff go. So looking at videos of, officers with ticket books and pens in their hands, trying to fire a handgun with their middle finger and a pen by their index finger because they can't drop the pen, all that kind of stuff. So you might just end up with stuff in your hands, whether you want it to be there or not. based on a human behavior
Right.
aspect that we have to learn how to manage, kind of as best we can.
Yes, and to explain the face I made, that's just because you were using kind of like absolute language, right? So always and never, and
Yep.
I'm like already red flagging it, in my head. But of course, your
Yep.
point was that correct. So that's a really good, just like rule of thumb. If you're ever worried about whether or not you should take someone's advice, always add a grain of salt, obviously. But like I just said it, always add a grain of salt. But
Always add a grain. In general, that's how yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Especially when I started, I was really quick to pick up on advice from anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And credentials look really sexy sometimes. Like my NRA certification looks really cool. Especially before I got it, I was like, whoa, like NRA cert. But man, that means so little. And I will always be transparent about that, just because I wouldn't want my sisters going to someone just because of an NRA cert. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, no, we have a very, talking about what Guy was talking about on his episode, we have a very unregulated industry. You can kind of say, you can kind of say whatever you want,
Mm-hmm.
kind of be whoever you want.
Yeah.
And it's up to the students to figure out, who is this guy really? Like, is he is he who he says he is? Is everything highly curated marketing that only shows him in his best light? All that kind of stuff. We've had situations of stolen valor, in the industry that always rock everybody. When some guy who's been a big name instructor for 5 years comes out and says, "Yeah, I said I was a recon Marine, but I actually wasn't a recon Marine. I wasn't in that unit, and I'm going to go ahead and shut down my training business. That's my baby, and go sell insurance for a little while." And it's like, yep, there's dudes saying there's dudes who said they've been through things, said they've been part of a unit, and they're not. And when they blow up, right, they become really big. It's hard to undo that lie, right? So yeah, those always they happen once in a blue moon, and everybody ruffles the feathers, right? But there's no superordinate governing body that says this is what a good instructor has. This is the minimum criteria, all that. So it's a Wild West.
Absolutely. Well, as far as topics that I wanted to cover today, of course, we went above and beyond, just like we always do, which is a good thing. I couldn't have cued this conversation any better. So thank you so much, Chris. I know you spend a lot of time on your research, and for you to come on and then share that with everyone else, and also cite your sources and give people the tools they need to become more informed themselves is just beyond useful. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. I always appreciate the opportunity. Your audience is fantastic. It's always great to chat with you, and I'm looking forward to good things in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Come back on. I think you've come on more than anyone, even Lisa at this point. I think you've beat her out.
Yeah, so Lisa, it's funny that I've met both of y'all, just through Instagram and all of that, but she's hilarious. I got to say, she is. Yeah.
She is. And she's very humble about what she does, but she also, I respect her so much, and that she's kind of like me. We like to stay in our lanes, and
Well, I just know her teaching at a local gun range. I've done that for years too, and you empathize with people who've been with the brand new student, which is not a bad thing, but you just get a lot of people there tell me about your background. Well, I've been around guns all my life. It's okay, this is gonna go okay,
right.
I know she gets
absolutely. Yes, that would be a fun episode too. Once I get a few classes under my belt, I can probably relate a little bit more. But,
definitely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And if you're listening and you're interested in exclusive content past what is posted on social media, you can become a Patreon member. If you would please visit the She Shield Instagram and TikTok at She Shield Pod for show updates, pictures of guest speakers, and podcast highlights. I'm really working on pushing a reel out a day of what I think are podcast highlights. So if that's something that interests you, if you maybe listen to this episode and you're like, wow, there's just so much good-ish, and I want to get, some more highlights under my skin, then you can head over there. And then a special thank you to Sagetta Gear, one of the official sponsors of She Shield. For concealed carry and duty gear, you can use code SheShield10 for 10% off your Sagetta Gear order. All resources mentioned in this episode will be listed in the show notes, which are the notes below the title. And if you like the podcast, you can help by liking, subscribing, and leaving a review. That's those little stars at the top of the page. If you would rate that would really help out the podcast. And if you or anyone you know is a firearms owner experiencing a crisis, look into holdmyguns.org. They are an organization that will connect you with a local gun shop or FFL to store your firearm for you, or at least an essential component of that firearm. The link to access their website and to find a storage location or partner is available in the show notes. Thank you for listening. In the meantime, stay safe and stay vigilant. Are you searching for a brand you can trust when it comes to shooting and gun care products? Look no further than Birchwood Casey. Since 1948, serious shooters, avid collectors, and professional gunsmiths have relied on Birchwood Casey. They've been in the game for over 70 years, providing us with products that have stood the test of time. From their legendary True Oil gunstock finish to the dependable Perma Blue, Birchwood Casey's commitment to quality is unmatched. Birchwood Casey has also revolutionized the way we train and improve our shooting skills with their innovative Shoot NC targets. These targets let you see your shots instantly, making it easier than ever to track your progress and become a better marksman. Head over to birchwoodcasey.com today and discover the products that have earned the trust of shooters worldwide. Use code SheShield to save and to support the podcast. That's SHESHIELD at checkout.